Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to CIO Leadership Live. I'm Mary Fran Johnson, the Executive Director of CIO Programs, and I will be the hostess today for a very lively and entertaining conversation with Klara Jelenkova, who is the Vice President and CIO at Rice University in the heart of Houston. Klara joined the university in 2015 as its first ever Chief Information Officer. So we'll have lots of interesting things to talk about around how you establish a new CIO role at a university the size of Rice. She's a key member of the President's Cabinet, and as such, oversees all of the technology investments and strategy at Rice, which is a private, independent university of more than 7,000 students. Before she came to Rice, Klara spent 5 years at the University of Chicago as the Senior Associate Vice President and a Chief Information Technology Officer. And then before that, she held a dual role in Duke University's Office of Information Technology, where she was the Interim Chief Information Security Officer and the Assistant VP of Shared Services and Infrastructure. So Klara, welcome. It's delightful to have you here today.
Thank you for having me, Mary Fran. I'm glad to be able to do this interview.
Yes, me too. Every time I've talked to you, I've learned so many great things, and we've always had great conversations. So I want to dive right in and talk about what it's like to come into a university and be the first ever CIO.
You know, it's really interesting because usually when you come as a new CIO, you're reacting to someone, right? There was somebody already in the role, and you're coming in and reacting. So I was really intrigued by the idea of being able to just create a position essentially from scratch, right? And I saw that opportunity as a huge benefit. And one of the things that I did not fully appreciate is that when you're bringing organization together from multiple pieces, because we had different parts of the organization that were reporting to different people, different vice presidents, the provost, etc.
Scattered.
That you're really essentially consolidating something that is more similar to shadow IT, right? So there are certain pieces that CIOs over the last 15, 20 years have built out that we did not necessarily have. So let me give you a few examples. We did not have a project management office. We had to build that out over the last 3 years so we can implement core systems. We did not have identity and access management group that was centralized. We established that as well. Integration practices that were historically more tied to individual systems. How do you have an integration platform and integration strategy so you can be a nimble IT partner to our units? So those are the types of things that you get to set the stage for your own role, but there's really a lot of heavy lifting that we as CIOs have been doing over the last 10 to 15 years that you get to do in a 3-year time frame.
Yes. Well, and before you got there, the President's Council, they spent a good year, 18 months, sort of studying up and figuring out what they wanted in a CIO.
That's right. So Rice did a self-study that was actually ran by our Vice President for Administration and faculty and dean's feedback to kind of try to think about, what did Rice want to do in 2014 and how to position Rice for new future, which is technology enabled. I mean, we are facing this today where there is a real need for a cohesive technology strategy across all enterprises, including higher education.
Of course, yes, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But I wanted to just go back to kind of your early days, and once you had set up a central IT organization and then you established some governance, what were the sort of things that came next? What were the most challenging areas that maybe things you didn't expect to encounter?
So I think let me start with the positive, because one of the wonderful things about starting this job was coming in as, if you will, a CIO to a senior cabinet. It was a new role, and I was amazed how my colleagues, fellow vice presidents, the provost, have been really ready to engage. And so we have just announced our vision for the second century, second decade, which is our new strategic plan. And it's amazing to see how with a role of a CIO at the cabinet level,
Mm-hmm.
people are talking about what can technology enable? How are things different today given the changing technology landscape? So one of the wonderful things have been there have not been preconceived notions. So you really got to function in a partnership mode and answer questions without people necessarily having historical kind of, you know, things have been this way for
Right.
the last 20 years. So I think driving innovation is actually easier
Mm-hmm.
when you are new.
Mm-hmm.
The unexpected things is, I mentioned it already. It's the heavy lift. You don't have anyone that was before you kind of doing this heavy lift of integration, identity management, centralized security,
Yeah.
project management office, and so
Yeah.
you get to do it all over again. The great thing is that you know a thing or two about it, so
Mm-hmm.
you can do it faster and more easily.
Right. Well, and I know one of the things that you created there was a chief information security officer role. So you brought a CISO role in there, and also you created groups that were doing business intelligence and data warehousing, and all of these were things that the university didn't have. So that's a lot of change management that you're talking about. And often when I interview CIOs, we spend a lot of time talking about how the soft skills part is really the hard part for a lot of chief executives. All the change management around that. How did you handle that, and how has that kind of changed over time?
It's really interesting because you kind of have two aspects of change management going on at once, right? You're internally changing an organization, so you have kind of this internal change management, including an HR strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You really need to think about talent development, talent management. And then you have change management at the external level, right? Because all of a sudden you're creating something new that did not exist, and people need to be able to connect with it, right? So you need to tell people externally, now let's say that we have a data warehouse and business intelligence unit. What does that mean for them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how does it work with the Office of Institutional Research? How do we enable people?
Yeah.
And you end up telling a lot of stories, actually.
Oh.
A lot of,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that people can relate, right?
Yes.
To the change that you're making. Because as exciting as we all may think that, Hadoop is, it doesn't really mean much in business, right? So
No.
Yeah. So you have to really make it much more accessible.
Yeah.
The one way that we have been, or I have been very much helped at Rice, is because Rice has an IT committee of the board of trustees. So most universities have a board of trustees, which is very similar to a corporate board.
Yes.
And that has subcommittees or committees. And Rice has an IT committee, and the IT committee was key in bringing me on board and hiring me. But it really shows kind of how the board is involved and understands the technology implications
Mm-hmm.
that exist even for higher education. And so in that way, being able to engage with the board at a strategic level around these issues has been extremely helpful.
Yes.
So that's kind of the external piece.
Mm-hmm.
On the internal piece, the change management is very hard, and I'm sure that, and I have heard other CIOs on your program talk about this, because it's war for talent out there.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, we have been a little bit fortunate in Houston because of the downturn of the oil industry.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same time, Houston is booming economy, and so how do you become a place where people want to work, and where there's a compelling story of an IT organization within the larger university that will make people say, hey, I really want to be at Rice. This is where I want to make my mark as an information technology professional.
Yeah. Well, let's explore that a little further. What is your talent acquisition strategy? Because you might think that someone working at a university just has their pick of the best graduate students in the computer science department, but it's probably not nearly that easy.
I wish. And the reason is because, remember, when you're a top 15 university in the United States, you're competing with Google and Apple and everybody for the same graduates because they come here and recruit, right? So one of the strategies that I have employed is actually not trying to hire graduate students after they graduate, but have them work in the IT organization either permanently during their time at Rice or during the summer as a summer internship.
Oh, excellent.
And so you're getting kind of the insights of the new generation. And, you know, even though we cannot, we may not be able to compete with Google, right? I mean, I think a lot of CIOs are facing that. We can still have the benefit of those students during the time that they are here. So we have a program which we call Technology Ambassadors. So, you know, Rice is very residential. 99% of our undergraduate freshmen live on campus and in colleges and what we call colleges. And we have one in every single college that is our ears to the ground and what's going on and informing what we need to be doing and giving us ideas. And then in the summer, we have graduate student internships in which students help us design applications that students use.
Okay. Well, and outside and beyond the students that you have, what are some of the kind of leading edge projects? What are the things that would attract other IT professionals to come to Rice?
You know, so, you know, I think one of the, you know, we talk a lot about disruption, right? Technology disruption. And every single industry is facing it in some way or another, right? Some sort of a technology disruption in the industry. And it can be frightening and scary. And I think in higher education, there's a very compelling piece to it, which is as people graduate and they're facing multiple job changes throughout their career, universities, and Rice is one of the universities, are really rethinking about how do we have lifelong engagement with students, not just Rice students, but you know other alumni from other institutions, and help people retool their careers. Right, so you know we have courses on Coursera on Python programming, and you know so because one of the opportunities that people have when they work for a university is actually to have an impact on the future of the United States and the future of the world, right? And helping people and thinking about how technology can be used to help people reshape their careers in mid-career, later in their career. You know, how can somebody who is 37 years old or 45 years old that wants to, you know, move from being a clerk in a financial institution to being a business analyst in a financial institution, how can they get a certificate? How they can get a graduate certificate while still working, being online, and really changing their lives. And that's a great place to be, right?
Yes, yes. Well, and I was thinking about that too. A lot of times when I talk with other CIOs, we tend to refer to various business units, and they're the ones that in private industry everybody knows. You know, there's the accounting department, there's HR. Universities are a little different in that you have different colleges and areas that are essentially your business units. So explain just a little bit about how you view that. What is the structure of, like, who are your business unit leaders that you spend most of your time, you know, dealing with and talking with?
Yeah, and I would just say we still have the same business units that others do, right? We still happen to have an accounting department.
Well, of course, yeah, right? And an HR department,
Exactly. So you know, so we have the normal business units, but then you know we have various schools, you know, engineering, natural sciences, social sciences, you know, that they're domain specific, as well as what we would call more professional schools such as business school and architecture and music that kind of provide very more specialized training.
Yes.
And so the way that we engage with them, Rice is actually very centralized from an end user support perspective. So we have IT staff in all of the schools that provide desktop support. And one of the transformational pieces that we have been working on is how do we use those staff members to give us information about what is going on in the schools.
Okay.
And how do we provide, how they give us intelligence on how centralized services need to change and how they need to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And so the engagement is at kind of my level is meeting with the deans and hearing about what they're trying to do and aligning the IT strategy with the school strategies.
Okay.
But also at the kind of ground level, do we really understand what is the customer journey, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is the day in life for a faculty member? What is a day in life for a student, for a departmental
Mm-hmm.
administrator? And do we have opportunities to actually make them better? And so we, like, for example, for the day in life and faculty member, we have a dedicated unit for teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And we have people that are dedicated to making sure that the classroom function as well as possible.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of technology in classrooms today.
Mm-hmm.
And so when a faculty member walks in, that podium works. And we have people that if any issue arises, we monitor them. We make sure that they're monitored so we know that everything is working. And if something
Right.
is not working, we dispatch people immediately because
Yeah.
within a school period, within a class period, the faculty member needs to be productive that entire time.
Right, and that's the time they have the students, and
Exactly.
they can lose them. God, if people didn't have wireless access, they would get up and leave.
Well, hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. No, not that that would happen. No, that's. Tell me, what is the size of the IT organization that you're running? What is kind of the size and scope of these people that are fanning out through all the colleges and taking care of IT throughout the university?
So, so again, Rice is a very small and exclusive institution, right? So we have, as you mentioned, we have 7,500 students, we have 600 faculty, about 2,000 staff. Out of the 2,000 staff, about 160 of them are in the central IT organization.
Okay.
And so that's, we need to be very efficient with what we do. And very nimble and agile.
Yeah.
And that's partially why we rely on, if you will, student employees and kind of in some ways distributed IT.
Yeah.
That may exist in some of the units to help us and kind of bring them into one IT family.
Right. Well, and that leads me to a conversation we had previously about shadow IT. You would think that you mentioned it in a very favorable light a few minutes ago, because you don't see shadow IT as a bad thing. You see it more as departmental IT leaders that you can bring into this IT family. Talk a little bit more about that. Has this always been your view at the other universities you worked at, or is this more exclusive to Rice?
Well, universities are fairly decentralized, right? And so I think if you're a CIO, you need to make a decision on what are the things where you can leverage scale, that you can centralize and actually drive economies of scale. And what are the things that are too specialized, that are difficult to actually really administer and manage centrally, and they're more aligned with a unit function. And so once you have those, if you kind of identify one of those, then you need to figure out how you're going to bring those people in so they are part of the IT family. They understand how we do integration, how we do identity management, how do we manage tickets, how do we do IT service management, but they can serve their unit in a more kind of specialized way while adhering to a certain set of principles. So I sometimes joke that it's, you need to set standards, and then once people adhere to the standards, you can actually give them levels of freedom to function in a way that makes sense for their unit.
Which is really where innovation happens, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you an example. So we just got an NSF grant with University of Utah to do next generation programmable wireless. And it's a faculty-driven effort. We have faculty that have been working on it for a number of years. It's a major NSF award that's going to, over time, change how wireless is done. Wow. They have that, so we are supporting them. We actually have provided staff to them to help with information about how we manage our wireless and kind of inform their design, but they still have software engineers that are working on this cutting edge technology. And so how do we all kind of play in the same sandbox? It actually can be very rewarding even for the IT staff, because they get to work on some next generation items that otherwise they wouldn't see, because they are not quite market ready, right? So it keeps their skills fresh.
Yeah. Do you end up working with startup companies or VCs in the Houston area? I know that there's a pretty thriving market around Houston, and I wonder, it seems like a university would be a natural place where they might congregate or even come from.
I could not have scripted you more. So we just announced with the mayor an innovation district in Midtown Houston, where all of the universities in the city are collaborating to create an innovation district. It happens that Rice had a really well-positioned property that is kind of halfway between the Texas Medical Center and downtown Houston, and it's really proximal to not just Rice University, but the other universities in Houston. And so we are trying to just kind of centralize and create that. So yes, there's an active collaboration, and it's not just, I think it's really important to think about the fact that it's not just one university driving it, because when you are part of a major city, and Boston is the same way, quite frankly, where you are, where it's not one university driving it, which you might have in a smaller town. It is the power of the university, the industry, and the city coming together and creating an innovation ecosystem.
Wow. How far along is it now? You said it's been announced, so you're in the very early stages of it?
Very early.
Yeah.
It was today. So.
Literally today. Okay.
This morning.
That's great. All right. Well, we're right on top of the news, which actually, and I was thinking of you too. I'm jumping ahead in my own script a little bit, but I couldn't help but think about you as I've been reading the stories about Mark Zuckerberg and his testimony before Congress about Facebook and privacy and identity access, because that's been a real specialty area for you in all of your other jobs. And I know I've read some pieces that you've written about it. So let's talk about that a little bit, the role that CIOs do play and should play in identity access management and privacy. So I'll start out by asking you, what have you thought about his testimony so far?
It's really interesting, because we are living in a world where the technology and the complexity of the technology is really outpacing the societal understanding and ways to grapple with it, right?
Yes.
And so you see governments such as EU with the global data protection, right, that are coming in and trying to set some sort of a standard. I think I think when people think back to this time of the testimony, they will realize that this was a really early period of us understanding privacy of information, right? And we are still trying to figure out what is the right balance. What are the institutional interests, the individual interests, the governmental interests, and where do they all meet? And in some ways, in kind of the physical space, we have negotiated it over hundreds of years, right? And now we are trying to negotiate it within a span of, 5 years?
Yes.
So it's complicated, very, very complicated.
Well, and I can remember the big uproar back in the 90s when Scott McNealy, who was the CEO at Sun Microsystems, said, it was essentially privacy is over, get over it, and this was way before privacy was nearly as over as it is now. I was reading an article in the New York Times today where one of the journalists went in and downloaded a tool that allowed him to look at everything Facebook had on him. And he was not even a regular user. He called himself kind of a lurker. He just went in occasionally. He rarely posted. And he was all kinds of shocked about all the information they had on the advertisers that he had. We just don't realize we're clicking on so many things when we're online. He was particularly shocked that Facebook Messenger had his entire iPhone address book. And, I'm not, and I read stuff like that, and I'm not sure if people should be as shocked because we are so probably unwittingly giving away that stuff when we agree, so and so would like to connect, and will you allow it? And you just click allow and you keep going.
Yeah, and I think one way to think about it is that this is all very new, right?
Yes.
And so on one hand you can say, well, people should know better, right? On the other hand you can say, well, this is really an emerging area, right? And I think we all need to kind of think through how much public information are we willing to have out there about ourselves.
Yes.
And so when you go back, just imagine going back 200 years when we were all living in some sort of a village, right? No, let's go like 1500s
Yes.
Europe, right? You had a little village. People lived inside of the village. They rarely ventured out, and they knew absolutely everything about each other, right?
That's right.
Technology makes all of the sudden this possible at an extreme scale,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so we need to think about, well, how much do we really want to be known? How much do we want to be unknown? And the concept of privacy has evolved even in the United States.
Yeah.
It's a fairly recent concept, right? So it's where exactly do we stand as individuals, and as a society is a question we will need to think through.
Yeah. Now, are there?
I feel like I'm skating in a in a difficult area,
in a dangerous area. Well, I don't want you to feel unsteady on your skates, but you have written about this enough, so you've given a lot of thought to identity access and privacy management. How is that translating into what you're doing at Rice? What are the sort of the policies that you've set or the choices that you've given people? How are you setting it up at the university?
Yeah, and I would just say, I was writing about this before it became a hot topic, so this is kind of it's kind of funny. Right? So I wrote this article that said, I think identity and privacy, the next frontier for the CIOs, and was a year ago.
But you were right. You were right. Yeah.
But so I think important thing to kind of realize about universities is that we are communities, right? So in a way, we are a little bit different than corporations that kind of think about a hierarchical structure. We don't really think about ourselves that way. So yes, it is true that we have administration and employees. But actually, a bigger part of our community are our students, are the people that engage with us, our alumni, and they're not really under our control in the same way that an employee is, right? So we don't get to make decisions for them.
Right.
And so we need to, and we are very heavily regulated even on the privacy side with students, with FERPA, with the federal protections for students, for student privacy. And so, but at the same time, we are trying to balance this need for collaboration. So universities collaborate at a very large scale. And I don't know if you know, but we run our own identity federation called In Common that allows us to kind of give access to resources across universities to each other, connect to global instruments, have those available. And so how do we create this trust fabric that allows us to collaborate without really threatening, people's privacy has been kind of on the forefront of our mind. So what we do is we run federated identity that actually uses Shibboleth, which is an open source software that we have been developing for a number of years, and In Common Federation. So that allows us to kind of connect to each other, but have this trusted framework for doing it. We are also now moving more toward, and early stages, toward giving people control, more and more control over how much information they release about themselves and how that information. And so that's, usually comes into play with things like CRMs for our community engagement, and how do we think about it, and how do we give people control over information that they are receiving from us. And I think in that way we are probably pretty similar to.
Well, and that also seems that it's more on maybe the leading edge, or the, you know, where privacy is going, where there is just a greater feeling on the part of the users that they want more control. And they may end up finding the control a little tedious, you know, all the things you have to check into. You know, when I was reading the article from the New York Times guy, and, you know, like the stuff that he had downloaded and all the things that he had looked at, and I thought it sounded like an awful lot of work to find out, you know, exactly what Facebook had on you, and then to end up all worried about it. I mean, it just, it made for a great article. It was interesting, but as I was reading it, I was thinking that I probably wouldn't be that, I don't know, into it, I guess, to go and drag all that out.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as CIOs, what we need to think about is, are we giving people the right options? So if someone wants to do it, can they do it? It's not necessarily about, you know, making people, you know, privacy hogs or something like that, because it's entirely possible that some people are so comfortable with their public lives or private lives even, that they don't really care about more people knowing about it, and they're willing, you know, so every single individual is going to make informed decisions in this space. And so I think CIOs should not actually worry about, is it, you know, do people want all of these choices, as long as those choices actually remain available, right? Are made available to the people who want them. And to be honest with you, that's the approach that Facebook, Google, others have taken, because the fact that not everybody wants to do it does not mean that it's not needed.
That some people don't want to do it. Exactly. Well, and that leads me into the whole emergence of government regulation coming in to protect and regulate, you know, individual access to privacy, is what has brought about that GDPR, which and so that's an example, that whole right to be forgotten. And since Rice University is international, and you have I think you said 27% of your student body are international students. How much work has that been for you to get ready for that? I think it launches next month in terms of the regulations are in place. How much of an effort was that?
You know, so this is a really interesting, this is an interesting question, because on one hand you can say, yes, there was effort involved, right? It's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, it has allowed us to engage with people and business owners and stakeholders in a new way, to talk to them about how they are managing their data, what are their business processes, what are the controls that they have over their data, and how do the different pieces of data that we have about people connect with each other. So we actually, even though it was work, don't take me wrong, we actually saw it as really enabling data security, because it has given us a vehicle to talk about data security in a very different way, in kind of how do we enable privacy and say, hey, this is a regulation that is coming, we really need to get our arms around it. And we were no longer kind of the security big stick, right? It was more about helping people understand and working with them. And so for us, even though again, I'm not saying that it was not work, we really viewed it as very enabling, actually, and a new way to engage with the business around certain concepts that can be a little bit hard to explain sometimes.
Well, that's a great observation, because it essentially made it personal. It made people more interested in it because it was actually going to affect them personally. Yeah, it wasn't being, you know, it wasn't being forced to watch another security video and pass your, because when we have conversations at our CIO events where I get CIOs and CSOs on a panel, and we talk about building resiliency into the organization and where the threats come from and all that kind of stuff. And over, the big threat tends to be the employees themselves kind of unwittingly doing things that will expose their intellectual property. We had when we did our Dallas panel, one of your colleagues, Mark Stone from Texas A&M, talked about how professors who travel internationally and go to conferences to share their research don't realize what a risk they may be putting the university at. So it's sort of an uphill climb to make sure you're educating all your different constituents on it.
Yeah, and and this is kind of, you touched on it in the New York Times article around privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But actually, security has even bigger issue, which is in order to secure information, that's a lot of work on the individual's side, right?
Yeah.
And so every single business is trying to stride, how do you have a mobile workforce that can work from anywhere? And in the same time, how do you secure that workforce?
Yes.
And what are the new pieces of information security approaches and technology that you need to put in place?
Mm-hmm.
And, I think all of us have read kind of the Beyond Corp work that Google has put forward, which is a very kind of innovative idea talking about you're no longer kind of this walled garden of an enterprise with the secure secure inside and bad outside.
Yeah.
It's networks are zero trust networks nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways universities have been on the forefront of this for a while because we have been open enterprises for a long time. We have people coming on campus every day to hear a concert, to go to a football game, to watch a performance. And all of those people get on our wireless network. So how do we kind of have this zero trust concept, so we can remain open and enable the community that we support, which goes much beyond just employee community.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of CIOs and IT leaders have given up on the notion that there's ever going to be a silver bullet product, that like something is going to come from a security vendor and you put this into place in your enterprise and you're all set. You got no more problems anymore. Everybody pretty much, that itself is a very shifting landscape. Several years ago, everybody talked about firewalls, and then it was pen testing, and but you've actually been a CSO, that role in the past. And one of the things you said about being a CSO was that you thought it was wonderful preparation for becoming a CIO. Talk a little bit about that. What is it about the Chief Security Officer role that helped you become the CIO you are today?
One of the things that, and I hope my CISO colleagues would agree, is that you have a very broad responsibility, but limited level of control, right? And I think in that way, it's similar to CIO roles where you need to really exercise a lot of influence. And you need to be able to communicate pretty complicated concepts at a business level, and you have to make trade-offs that are based on, and security, it's how much risk, how much innovation do you want to drive, and how much risk you're willing to accept in order to achieve those goals, right? That's one of the key questions that every CISO is trying to answer is, I can secure the enterprise, but then the enterprise is
locked down. Yeah.
It's locked down, right? And then it's not going to be a vibrant community, or it's not going to be a vibrant enterprise. So, how much risk am I willing to take in this scenario, and how do I engage the board about the discussion of that risk, right? And so I think in that way, teaching you how to think about this kind of the business alignment, risk, strategy. I think in that way, the CISO role is very similar to the CIO role.
Excellent. Well, and I was thinking too, when you talked about the IT committee, the subcommittee of the Board of Trustees, I wondered what are the agendas like for that? What sort of things are on the list of topics that they want to talk about, and who are the other, what are some of the other functions on that committee with you?
Yeah, so the committee, the people who are on the IT committee, finance, administration, right? All of the people that are kind of users or partners in the delivery, right? Or in the delivery of the business outcomes that the technology enables, right? So the topics, as you can imagine, security is actually a standing topic on our agenda, right? So that because that's just a really big piece of every CIO's role. The other topics we discuss. Support for teaching and learning, digital education. How do we kind of enable that transformation that is happening in higher education? Support for research. So we have, every university is a major research enterprise. A lot of research is computational. We actually have a Center for Research Computing that is a group in the IT organization that is that we run in collaboration with the Ken Kennedy Institute for Information Technology, which is faculty-led. And how do we bring technology resources to bear to help faculty solve problems? So those are computational resources, high performance computing, those types of things that we run centrally, storage resources to save their research, publish their research, etc. And then the third is I would say administrative computing, right? Business transformation. And even though it's not, that's not the most exciting thing, it's required, right? How are you rethinking your processes, especially as we are moving to cloud-based ERPs, right? And kind of even to the kind of the post-ERP world where we are integrating, how are we managing business processes across multiple applications and still enabling the enterprise?
Right. Well, and one of the things that we had talked about previously, you'd mentioned, is that how IT has to support both traditional and digital education and how much that balance between the two is likely to shift in the future. Tell me a little bit about how your staff is organized to kind of deal with both of those worlds.
Yeah, so again, we have one unit that is teaching and learning, and we really support teaching and learning technology or learning environments. And so in some ways, whether or not we are working with a school on, within a classroom or within a virtual classroom, really doesn't make any difference. We are very closely collaborating with, a faculty-led unit dealing with digital education and really kind of the MOOC space as well. And how do we help them and enable them? But it really is more about, for us, how do we understand the curricular needs of the faculty and then making sure that the technology is there to deliver it however they wish to deliver it.
Okay. Interesting. Well, one of the other things we talked about, and this kind of falls under the bigger umbrella of leadership, that larger issue about the CIO role itself and how just in your career, it has really shifted from being a service provider to much more of a business partner. And I know when you got to Rice, that was kind of a delightful part of the discussion, is that you were talking as a fellow business leader to all the other leaders of the different parts of the university. So I wanted to just sort of center in on how you've used that role as a partner to, for instance, drive innovation efforts out of the IT group.
Yeah, so and I talked about it a little bit, right? Which is how do we partner with faculty and enable their research, and then see what are the pieces that we can bring to kind of enable that research, right? So so that's kind of for us. Remember that we can tap into not just phenomenal students, but also incredible faculty. And we have computer science and we have engineering, and these faculty are just doing amazing things that are going to shape the future of technology, right? So, so for us, it's more, how do we work with them and try to figure out what things are actually applicable to the enterprise today, right? So on kind of the leadership level is, I think it's really important. Businesses go through strategic planning, universities go through strategic planning, is to have the CIO at the table to think about if these are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. So for us, we just roll out the vision for the second decade that has undergraduate education, graduate education, growing faculty, improving research, being digital and global, and increasing our footprint through digital and global endeavors, and then supporting Houston, which is fourth, soon to be third largest city in the United States, and how do we kind of work with Houston about a set of issues that we have as a city that you have all probably learned about last fall when we had a small hurricane sitting over us, right?
Yeah.
And so
not so small.
Right. And so the hurricane was an example where the IT organization was able to come in and actually partner with the university on developing some innovative technologies that had to do with response to a disaster, right?
Oh, okay.
So, right, so what happened was we had, as the hurricane was coming in, because we are largely residential, businesses can kind of shut down. The university doesn't get to shut down because we have students, we have staff there. And, we are 24/7, 365 operation.
Yeah.
And so
that's a good point.
We were working with the provost office, the other offices across the university to actually develop different apps and analyses that allowed us to find out where people were at, were their houses under threat, were they able to get to work, what were the impacts that they had, and then that the hurricane presented. And remember, that situation was constantly shifting, right? So somebody could be under threat of evacuation one day and not the next, and this was continuously changing. So how do you kind of have an idea and really good read on what is the entire extended community going through? What are the services that we need to provide for our students, but also for our staff, for our faculty, and how do we shape those based on the data that we were able to obtain from our community, analyze, and then give, let's say, HR or give to the provost office to know what to do next.
Okay. Well, and that reminds me, too, to ask you about data analytics, because that's something I know that's always in the top 5 issues for most CIOs. What sort of an approach have you taken? What kind of things are you innovating around to make that data-driven organization happen? Because the data is always so tightly involved with whatever innovations are in the pipeline. There's almost always a data layer and some analytics involved. So what sort of things do you have going on in that realm?
Yeah, so it was really interesting coming in 3 years ago, because we actually had to do a fairly heavy lift around a data warehousing initiative. And one of the pieces that was really critical was, since we didn't have a data warehouse before, the really important piece about building one of those things is having common data definitions and common understanding of data, right? Yeah. So we kind of brought in a group together that we called the data stewards that can really have a conversation around different data elements, what they mean, how they should be shared. And by the way, when GDPR came in, that was the same group that we could utilize to kind of take that conversation to the next level, to the privacy level around the data, right? Okay. So that kind of creating that community. So from that perspective, we basically have a set of data sets and analysis ready data sets that we make available primarily to the Office of Institutional Research that provides reports and other things that are discussed. But we also kind of subscribe, just as everybody else, to benchmarking services. And the question then, the issue that we're trying to work through is, how do you take your internal data that you have generated and kind of compare it or match it with the benchmarking data that we have, and how does that then inform the future of your programs, et cetera?
Interesting. The and you brought up at one point mentioning the global aspects of a lot of this. You've recently expanded your role, or your role has been expanded for you to include Rice and in the international scene. Talk about what that brings to your CIO role. What are these new duties that you've taken on?
Well, so I think, CIOs are enabling international initiatives everywhere, right? Yeah. Because, fundamentally, the world beyond borders is the digital world,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so, the second the second we started to put up web pages, we started to kind of break through the barriers of, space, right? And limitations of where we were physically.
Yeah.
So, when I was at University of Chicago had centers. So we actually, built a center in Beijing, Hong Kong, New Delhi. And when we were thinking about this strategy at Rice, the truth is that when you are doing it several years later, it's always amazing how when you do something, ask the same similar set of questions, few years later, your answer might actually change. So the question has become, how do we use technology to actually increase Rice's footprint and impact? Because for us, it's really about impact, impact of our research, impact of our community. Yeah. And for that, technology plays a critical role. And so it's communication, it's how do we form partnerships with other universities? How do we form partnerships with places across the globe in order to really make our community more vibrant?
Okay, so how does that change what you do on a week-to-week basis? What are some of the kind of new tasks that you now have to pay additional attention to?
So one thing that has been really helpful has been engaging with faculty on what are the international research or scholarship components that they're trying to do, and are there ways that technology can make it easier, right? Okay. So having really that conversation in a much more structured way. So rather than saying these are the services that we provide, really thinking about it from the end user perspective. And I actually think that's one of the things that CIOs can do that can be very empowering for CIOs, is to take the point of view of the clients and engage the business in a new view, in a new way by essentially projecting what the clients want to the business, right? Yes. And mapping those customer journeys. So in that way, I think that I expect that the job is going to change in really kind of understanding what are the international aspirations that Rice has, but also that our faculty have, and how technology can make those easier.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of something I'm often telling CIOs when I talk with them, and it used to be something that it was a kind of a theme that marketing people owned, where they were always looking at new things, and it was always about how do you bring people something they never knew they always wanted. And in a lot of ways, that idea about bringing to the board, bringing to the other business partners you work with, something that technology can enable that they didn't realize how much they wanted it once, you got it underway. And I think that is so much more relevant today to CIOs in their strategic roles than it is. I've never liked the notion of CIOs aligning with business strategy, because to me that always implies that the strategy has already been set and the CIOs being informed about it, and then they get in line and they help it with enabling technologies. I much prefer the kind of approach where CIOs are accelerating the strategy of their businesses, whether it's a university or a healthcare center, by bringing these technologies to the table, by introducing their colleagues to things they never knew they always wanted.
And I think that's actually a great point, because in some ways, it was at one point in the past that kind of CIOs were very much technology leaders, right? And it was we kind of discuss things in fairly technical ways. Yeah. Well, now you really see CIOs need to understand all aspects of the business, whatever the relevant business is, and be able to do the translation from what the technology can do into how it can enable business, right? Exactly. And so so you need to really become pretty savvy on how different parts of the enterprise work, so you can actually engage in that conversation. Now, I think many if not all CIOs are ready to do that because we have been watching these business processes in our systems forever, right?
Yeah.
So we sometimes know them
Yes.
exceptionally well.
Yes.
And it's just really about having the opportunity to talk about how they can be shaped or changed through or evolve as technology evolves.
Well, it's making much better use of that helicopter view that we've talked about for years and years about. And I heard one CIO described it. He said it's one thing to get the seat at the table, but the important thing to do is don't sit around too much once you've got that seat at the table. He was like, get out there and be out in front and understanding the customer journey. And, you know, that it sounds like, I know that you do that a lot at the university. You get out meeting with a lot of your colleagues. In fact, and that leads to my next topic as we're getting close to the top of the hour, about leadership and time management. And I don't know whether you wrote this or whether you mentioned it to me, but you said you found Stephen Covey annoying yet effective. And that idea about the importance of evaluating where and how you're spending your time.
I know, and so I do this crazy thing where at least once a year I actually do the Covey exercise of kind of how I'm spending my time.
Yeah.
And I see it as an important reset of my own priorities, because I think, as CIOs, we all, there's a strategic piece and then there's the operational piece. And we all are running complicated, fairly large enterprises, right, that have multiple components to them. And it's very easy to just kind of, go in there, right?
Yep.
Go into this operational piece and deal
job.
with the immediate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I find that it's very helpful to actually go through this exercise of, am I really spending enough time, enough of my own time and of my own kind of intellectual capacity, if you will, in engaging with what is the future and what is next, mapping out how we could help someone. And, one of the things that I learned along the way is that, what matters is that you propose an idea and you make the best possible proposal you can make. And it's okay if people don't go with it, right? As long as you have made the argument. Because, people can, the business can decide to do something slightly different, or they may decide to not do this just yet. But what matters is that you spend the energy in kind of honing in an idea, proposing it, having it debated, and ultimately, some of them will always make it, right? So it's important that as a CIO, you're spending enough time proposing more things in some ways than you can actually achieve, because some of them will not get funded. We all know that, right? Things will not get funded. So you have to kind of sometimes a little bit divorce yourself from
an emotional attachment to your idea or your project.
That is correct. Thank you very much. Right? Because otherwise it will stop you. It can actually stop you from thinking creatively, because if you're worried too much about losing an argument, then you don't spend enough time refining it and honing it.
Well, it's funny. I've had some conversations just recently. I can't remember what we were working on, but I was talking with a lot of female IT leaders and asking a lot of them what they wish they had done sooner in their careers. And almost always the thing that everybody wishes they had done was speak up more often, more frequently, like step forward and have the idea and get it out there. And I know that's a topic close to your heart about women in IT leadership, because unfortunately we're still kind of a minority. It's probably less than 10% of all CIOs are actually women CIOs. Do you have any advice or words of wisdom for younger women who are in the IT profession now, things that maybe thinking back you wish you'd done sooner?
So it's interesting. I mean, I think senior women in IT actually have a responsibility for mentoring the next generation. And, I know all of us do some portion of this because it's very, very important. So I can relate a story. When I was in my 20s, we had a new CIO coming in at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was working before I went to Duke. So here I am, a kid in my, I was 25, I think, or something. And the CIO Annie Stunden, who was retired since, but was one of the really kind of major CIOs in higher education, was giving a town hall, and I raised my hand as the first person to ask her a question. And I asked her a question, and she made a connection with me and actually helped me throughout my career.
Wonderful.
And I think for for senior women CIOs, being that mentor, and for women that are earlier in their career, finding those mentors and being willing to speak up and ask for mentorship and being open to mentorship is very important.
Yes. Well, and I can't help but bring up the person who got you into coding, because it's so rare that I run into someone whose mom got them into IT. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so my mother is a visionary. So my mother was one of the people, when you watch Hidden Figures, my mom was, is that generation, right? And she has a PhD in mathematics, and she worked on, computers back when, there were, punch cards and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And she was a program, she was an analyst. And when I was young, when I was a kid, my mom said I had to learn to code, and so I hope the statute of limitation has expired, but my mother actually smuggled an Atari computer from West Germany. This is so this is way back, right? To Czechoslovak Socialist Republic to get me a computer, because back then computers were outlawed, obviously, in personal. So she smuggled the computer for me, and then I learned how to code at home, and she taught me. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing to have a mother like that?
That is amazing. That is amazing. Well, and it clearly has paid off in the long run. So all hail to mothers everywhere who are pushing their kids onto the forefront. And I know, because one of my kids ended up working at Google and used to do a whole lot of video game playing when he was in high school. And I used to say, you might end up going into IT, and he really poo-pooed the idea. But now he's a senior reliability engineer at Google, working on all this heavy-duty back-end database stuff. And I just have to chuckle, because I knew all along that was probably where he was headed. So
see, you also are an IT enabling mother.
I know, another pushy
Shaping
mother.
The future of your children.
Yeah, we need more computer tiger moms. That's probably what we need.
Yeah, I think it would be a great conversation on Mother's Day.
Yes.
Computer pioneering mothers making their children successful.
Yes, which is coming up just a few weeks from now. So, but anyway, we are at the top of the hour, so this has been so delightful, but I have to say goodbye to you now. So thank you so much, Clara, for taking part in the conversation today. I think we got to hit on all of the topics that we discussed, and I hope I didn't skate you too far outside your comfort zone with the Zuckerberg stuff, but that is pretty fascinating these days. So I will wrap up. Thanks very much to our audience for sticking here with us. We'll be back again in a few weeks with another version of CIO Leadership Live, and we really thank, and it's been a great pleasure talking today with Clara Jelenkova from Rice University. And I encourage you, if you just joined us at the last few minutes of this, we will have this posted tomorrow to our Twitter feed and also on... What are the other? Let me see. We are also on iTunes, on SoundCloud. You can hear an audio podcast of this, and it will also be posted to our website on CIO.com. So thanks very much for listening, and we will see you next time.